All right, guys. So today we're going to be talking about some more quadrilaterals, and we talked yesterday about parallelograms. Well, today we're going to get more specific. So all the shapes we're talking about today, we're going to talk about three different quadrilaterals: rectangles, squares, and rhombi. Okay, that's the plural for a rhombus. So that's the three we're going to be talking about, and all three of these are actually still parallelograms. Okay, they just have more specific characteristics about them than parallelograms do. So it'll make more sense as we get into this. So let's first talk about rectangles. So one thing that we know about rectangles as far as the sides go is the same thing we know about any parallelogram. Opposite sides are congruent. Okay, so this is congruent to this, and this side's congruent to this side. That's still true for a rectangle. That's nothing different than any other parallelogram. Okay, so the angles though, with a rectangle, all angles are right angles, okay, or 90 degrees. So this, they're all 490 degrees. The same rule is still true for parallelograms, that the opposite angles are congruent to each other. Those are congruent, and these are congruent to each other. But more specifically, we know they're all four congruent because then we know that they're all 90 degrees in a rectangle. As far as the diagonals go in a rectangle, still true that they bisect each other. They still bisect each other just like any parallelogram, but we also know that they are congruent. Okay, so for a rectangle, these two bisect each other, but they also bisect each other in such a way, since they're congruent, that all four pieces are the same. So this isn't going to be 2 and 2 because they're the same length. So when I bisect each one, the resulting segments are all the same. Okay, which is kind of cool because then you get isosceles triangles in here. You can see this is an isosceles triangle, and so is this one, and then also the other triangles are isosceles. So you get into using triangle properties a lot of times when you talk about rectangles with diagonals because they result in isosceles triangles a lot of times. All right, so let's go on and talk about rhombi. So again, a rhombus is a parallelogram because all the opposite sides are parallel to each other. Okay, so that's one thing with a rhombus that is still true, but also all sides are congruent. So it's not just the opposite sides that are congruent. Okay, all four sides are congruent. So that's one unique thing about a rhombus. As far as the angles go, it's basically the same as any other parallelogram. Opposite angles are congruent. So this angle and this angle are the same, and this one are the same. And also the same thing is true. The same side interior angles are supplementary or supplemental, which means that these two angles right here equal 180 degrees, right? So that's what supplementary means. Those two are going to add up to be 180, each on the same side will. Okay, now as far as the diagonals of a rhombus, they are not congruent. Okay, they're not going to be congruent. So that's different than a rectangle where they are congruent. Also, the diagonals are still going to bisect each other. But since they're not congruent this time, these will be the same, but the other diagonal will have different tick marks because they're not congruent. Okay, so that's one thing. And then this is a new thing about the diagonals of a rhombus. They are perpendicular. Okay, perpendicular. So right here, this is going to make a 90-degree angle. And right here's a 90, right here's a 90, and right here's a 90. So they're 90-degree angles all the way around in a rhombus, which is a new property that we haven't really talked about yet. But the diagonals on a rhombus are perpendicular. All right, so last one to talk about is a square. Everybody's favorite shape, right? So with a square, it's like combining the properties of a rectangle and the properties of a rhombus together. okay, because the sides of a square are all congruent. Okay, so it's like a rhombus in that aspect. They're all congruent. The angles are all right angles, which is like a rectangle. Okay, so they're all right angles. And then diagonals, okay, they're going to bisect each other. Okay, they're also congruent, like a rectangle, and they're perpendicular, like a rhombus. Okay, so since they bisect each other, this is the same. Since they're congruent, these are going to be the same also, and they're perpendicular. Okay, so now you also right here get into the same situation we had with rectangles, where you get these isosceles triangles on the inside of your square. So you can use triangle properties a lot of times with rectangles and squares. All right, so yeah, squares is kind of like you combine a rhombus and a rectangle together. So we're going to go ahead and flip over on the other side and look at these shapes right here. So what I want you to do, I'm going to go ahead and pause the video, and I want you to look at these shapes and determine which of the three three parallelograms they are. Are they a rectangle? Are they a square? Or are they a rhombus? All right, so go ahead and do that real quick. All right, so here are the answers, and hopefully you're able to get these. So first off, just to explain where these answers come from. This first one, you can see that your diagonals are not congruent because you got one tick mark and two tick marks. So you know it's not going to be a rectangle or a square, and of course they're perpendicular. So it's got to be a rhombus. Okay, so those two characteristics are true for a rhombi or for rhombi. Okay, so the next one. Okay, we still know it's a parallelogram, so the opposite sides got to be congruent. So these two got to be the same, and these two got to be the same. And then also opposite angles got to be congruent because it's a parallelogram. So this has to be 90. Well, so if it's 90 and 90, these other two got to be 90 also, because they got to add up to be 180 as a parallelogram. So they've got to add to these other two to make 180. So we can see we got all four angles the same and all four sides the same. Those are characteristics of a square. Number 3, this is 90. The opposite one's 90. So again, this is 90 and this is 90 for the same reasons as the square. But we can see that the sides are not all the same. So the best we can say this one is it's a rectangle. All right. The fourth one, opposite sides are the same. That's all the information we have. We can tell that the angles look different, so we would say this one's a rhombus. Okay, because if all the sides were the same and all angles were the same, it'd be a square, but the angles are obviously different. Number 5, this is a rectangle because all of your diagonals are the same. So you got one tick mark. You got one tick mark on each, so you know that the angles or the diagonals are the same, but they don't make a perpendicular intersection. So you don't have a square, you've got a rectangle. And then the last one, now you've got all four the same, but you got a perpendicular, so that tells us, okay, that one is a square. So I hope you're able to classify these now by looking at the shapes and seeing information about the diagonals and things. So let's look down here at this chart, and we'll be done. I want you guys to see if you can fill out this chart right here. So just put a check mark in the boxes that are true underneath the proper shape. So if you think a rectangle, if all angles are congruent, if you think that's true, then you put a check mark right there. Okay, if it's not, just leave it blank. So give you guys some time to do that, and we'll talk about it. All right, so here's where your check mark should be. All right, with all angles are congruent. That's true for rectangles and squares, but not rhombi. Sides are congruent for rhombi and squares. Diagonals are congruent for rectangles and squares. And then diagonals are perpendicular for rhombi and squares. The diagonals bisect vertical angles. Okay, so this one's one we might not talk about a lot. Let me go back to the picture real quick. Diagonals bisect vertex angles. So right here, you've got if this is your diagonal, this is your diagonal, what this is saying is these diagonals cut this angle into 2 equal pieces, and they cut this angle into 2 equal pieces. Okay, that is true for rhombi and for squares, but as you can see, this rectangle right here, this angle is a lot smaller than this angle. So this diagonal right here does not bisect this upper left angle right here. Okay, it does though for squares and rhombi. Okay, and then the last few down here. These four are all, these are the properties that we already talked about yesterday for parallelograms. Okay, so since these are the 4 properties of parallelograms, those are true for all 3 shapes, rectangles, squares, and rhombi. Both pairs of opposite sides congruent, both pairs of opposite angles congruent. Any 2 consecutive vertex angles are supplementary. That's just same side interior angles are supplementary. It's just another way of phrasing it, consecutive vertex angles. And then diagonals bisect each other. So those are the 4 properties of parallelograms. All those are true for these, which is why they're all parallelograms, because they all follow those 4 properties. But you get into these more specific properties as you talk about each individual shape. All right, so hopefully that gives you some more clarification on rectangles, rhombi, and squares. Time to practice.